We're ready to go. My name is Peter Maravelis. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live. This is the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of our in-store calendar. It began during the shelter in place. We continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums throughout the month of June and into August. It has been 15 weeks since the lockdown was imposed. We're happy to say that City Lights has finally reopened its doors to the public. Following San Francisco Health Department guidelines, we aim to make our reopening as safe as possible for the public and our workers. So please do come and visit us. You'll be able to once again browse our stacks. Our business hours will be Monday through Saturday from 12 noon to 8 p.m. We are quite excited about our reopening. We've worked very hard to transform the store. The entrance is now on the Broadway side of the building at 271 Columbus. The original entrance is now an exit only, so we encourage everyone, please do wear masks while visiting the store. So as many of you know, City Lights is a publishing house as well as a bookstore. Through the month of June, we're offering 7 free ebooks of anti-racist publications produced by our publishing arm. This is offered in a spirit of solidarity with all those who are joining the collective fight for a better and more equitable world. These titles include such works as Julian Bond's Selected Works, also Bayard Rustin's biography, Troublemaker for Justice, the newly released title from Hillary Moore and James Tracy, No Fascist USA, and numerous other titles. So check them out on our website at www.citylights.com. So it is a great pleasure to have with us tonight a couple of our friends
people in Vegas
who are no strangers to City Lights. We have hosted them on numerous occasions. We're really great fans of their work. So this is really a bit of a homecoming for us. I am, of course, speaking of John Freeman and D.A. Powell, both seasoned poets. John is celebrating the release tonight of his new book. Although he is known primarily for his editorial skills and his excellent prose, he's also a brilliant poet. So his new collection of poetry is called The Park. It is published by the venerable Copper Canyon Press. This is John's second book of poetry. Actually his debut is called Maps. And it was published in 2017. As many of you know, he is the editor of Freeman's, a literary biannual of new writing, and also the executive editor of LitHub. He's written numerous books. These include How to Read a Novelist and a Dictionary of the Undoing, as well as a trilogy of anthologies about inequality, including Tales of Two Americas, Stories of Inequality in a Divided Nation, and Tales of Two Planets, which feature storytellers from around the globe, speaking about climate crisis. So his work has been translated into more than 20 languages. He has appeared in the New Yorker, Paris Review, and the New York Times. He is the former editor of Granta and is a writer in residence at New York University. So he's going to be joined tonight by D.A. Powell. Doug is one of San Francisco's great poetic treasures. He's the author of 5 collections of poetry, including Chronic, the winner of the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award, the books Tea, Lunch, Cocktails, and his most recent book is called Useless Landscape, or A Guide for Boys, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry. So you can purchase tonight's books via the links that is going to be posted on the chat function on your screen. So it is really such a great pleasure to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be at City Lights, even if it's not, actually at City Lights.
I wonder how, Doug, do you want to go first or should I read first?
It's your call. This is your night.
Well, I'll start just simply by saying it's really nice to be in City Lights without actually being there, because it's a long way from home. And I can imagine what it's like to sit in that room. And it's also just great to be with Doug, because Useless Landscape, this book that Peter just mentioned, was it's such a beautiful book. And if any of you are listening and are poets, for me, it was as a Californian, it was a revelation, and that you can write about the frame of a landscape and all the things that come with a frame and the problems that come with a frame, and still put yourself in the middle of that landscape, and have it feel natural and real. And I feel like that is incredibly important in a time when it feels like we live in a built landscape that's out of control, and that is sometimes very, very worrying, not just in California, but obviously the rest of the world. And I found in reading Useless Landscape a kind of reclaiming of the spaciousness of what can happen inside of a frame. Love and desire and humor and every kind of thing in between. So it's just kind of it's a real pleasure to read with you, Doug. I'm going to start off by reading a brief poem, not by myself, but by a Danish poet named Lars Skinnebach. It's from a book called The End of the World as We Know It, which I think is probably something maybe on our minds right now. It's a really short poem. It's translated by a Californian, or someone who lives in California right now, Susanna Need. It's very brief, and it has some of the same qualities you find in Doug's poems, like this incredible, almost invertebrate ability to move around lines, humor, and an acceleration towards an ending, which is often surprising. And this is called The End of the World as We Know It. One year, I lived on sandworms, and I lay down in the dunes. When the disco closed, when the border closed, the interpreters killed immigrants and put the heads on stakes. I hid my knives in the heather. I laid sliced off lips on the hummocks as a sign for others, lost in it all. And when the ants came, I followed them down underground where they lived, blocked their exits, and plundered their nests, and plundered their stores. Minerals, eggs, and dust. Minerals, food, and knowledge. And I poured saliva into their saliva. So I'll start on a happy poem. I wanted to read that just slightly because I think we're in a time of jubilant cruelty, and it's important to just acknowledge and then move away from it. But I feel like it's really hard to do that in a poem, because a poem's natural instinct, I think, is towards joy, or to something that feels in language like joy. This was kind of the state of my mind when I was writing The Park, which is set on 4 seasons around Luxembourg Gardens, where I live part of the year. Boo-hoo, poor me. As a teacher at a university program in Paris. And, this is starting in around 2016, and I simply just felt, I felt a lot of despair. I felt like for a long time, the bonds between us as citizens locally and then abstractly were being torn apart on purpose for reasons that are obvious, and then sometimes just for reasons that didn't seem to be a reason at all. It just seemed to be a possibility, maybe by technology or something else. And I would go to the park, and usually at the beginning of the day, and I'd feel really, really down. And then within minutes, I would feel a little bit better. Of course, it's a beautiful park, and I look the way I do, and I don't get accosted, but there was something about the park that I felt like was utopian. And then I realized it's not a utopia for everyone in the park, including me. And I started writing poems about just sitting there. And this was the first one. It's called The Sacrifice. The difference between animals and us, the main one is, they don't need to know it's a park. The coyote lopes through just the same, looking for food. We stop in mourning, sensing everything we've lost. We call that ceremony a park. So the seasons kind of turn, and in the middle of them, I start just paying attention, and I only have my own 2 eyes, and I sort of tried to write to the limit of what is possible to see with just observation. I know it's a limited optic, but it's what I have. And so a lot of this book is me participating, but looking at things. So this poem is called Seeing Things. Now the trees rustle, sorry, let me start. Now the trees rush, crackle in the dark. I sleep like a sailor on night watch. I was told, look in the shadows for figures that freeze. I can see straight through the park. There are the camps. There are the beds. There, a man washing his foot in rainwater. You do not need to be a hawk to see here. No one talks of this, how winter doesn't just strip bare. It allows us to see what's always been there. So one of the peculiar things about living on the outskirts of this park is that obviously the park is beautiful, but it's closed. And sometimes people want to sleep in the park and they get kicked out of the park. And some of the people passing through the park trying to stay there were migrants, some of them who had been ejected from wars in the Middle East. And in the middle of that happening, and in the middle of that patrol being observable every day in the park, there was an exhibit on the outside of the park of photographs of Syrian migrants, some of whom had walked all the way to Europe. And so throughout this book, I'm thinking, I think, a hope about just who's allowed to belong. And one of the things that was celebrated in the park was the gift of the Statue of Liberty. And I wrote a poem about this called The Gargantuan Arm. The Gargantuan Arm. Let us remember liberty was not popular. 7 years it took Laboulaye to convince Bartholdi a gigantic statue was what New York Harbor needed. 10 years later, the Frenchman arrived in Philadelphia with her gargantuan arm, 30 feet high, nearly 2 tons of torch, displayed at the peak of America's backward slide into emancipation. It looked like a statue sunk in sand. So were its finances. The same month, Joe Reed was dragged from his cell in Nashville, Tennessee, and hung from a suspension bridge by an angry mob. Quote, hardly had Reed been lodged in jail than the subject of lynching him had become general conversation, the Memphis Commercial Appeal reported. Their fundraising tour in Philadelphia complete, Bartholdi and crew dismantled the appendage, packed it into crates, and loaded her onto a train to New York City. For 5 years, the arm sat in Madison Square Park as Harper's railed against Americans having to pay for its pedestal, raising pennies, coins. You could climb up inside Liberty. It was grand, a view, but the person taking your tickets could not. People loved it. Workers on the project back in France got married, had children, died. Kipling came to Paris in 1878 when Bartholdi showed the head and was told he peered through the eyes of liberty herself. That same month, Michael Green was dragged from his cell in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, a noose thrown around his neck and his body raised 15 feet from the ground, left there until the following morning. In May 1884, an American businessman in Paris hosted an opulent banquet in Bartholdi's honor. All of Parisian society there, enclosed, pressed, and washed by others. Black servants moving through the room swiftly. Did anyone regard the army over their heads to whisk away the china and cutlery before a new course arrived? Did they marvel at the strength of a human-sized arm that can carry a tray weighing 30 or 40 pounds and remain unseen, not spill a drop of wine or sweat? And did any of the men waitering that night pause for a cigarette or stand outside, looking in at the glass banquet hall with its crystal chandelier and its small scale model of liberty? And no, it was not for him. So as the book goes on, I'm trying to think about other forms of parks that are maybe not parks. Ultimately, if you, I think, look at the world itself, it's kind of a giant built environment that's full of structures and civilizations, and it's curated, and it has values in that curation. So in the latter parts of the book, I start thinking of parks I've been to that maybe weren't parks, but are operating under similar auspices, I guess. This is a poem called Walks in the Dark. I don't know if anyone else had the pleasure of going to Christian camp. I did. Fell out of my bunk bed on my face at night. My dad said all night long he heard people falling out of the bunks. This is not that part of the camp. This is something else. This is called Walks in the Dark. The woods were stark and bluish green, lit by our candles. 90 young boys singing, walking to the lake full of catfish and carp, holding our father's hands, the white votives dripping, the woods darker still because of those teardrops of light. Our father's hands dry and cracked and large, the lake, its black water, absolutely waveless, and then the candles floating out upon it, turning its surface liquid, showing how easy it is to swirl darkness with a pinprick of light. This is what we were meant to learn, sing to. Only I remember how the morning after, I learned the lake was a reservoir, water we stole from the trees that gave us shade, and I found the dam holding back the hoarded water. It was clogged with the candles, which were soggy and gray, and not at all like prayers. This is a poem called On Love. I leave the spread of your hair and walk into the park, sit in the hollow of night's carcass. Others are here, lovers stranded by love, islands beneath the cerulean sky. They stare into the trees, not looking, not seeing, but holding the small part of themselves they do not give in order to give, cupping it like tiny blue flames. And I'll read two more short poems and then pass to my friend Doug. This one's called Charity. In the mouth of the church, 2 men, 3 women, picnic away from the rain. A man in rags, beside them sleeping. Before they plate sandwiches, cornichons, fresh pears, cold meats. A piece of bread is broken from the loaf. Wine poured into a red plastic cup. Placed by his body, care taken not to waken him. And this is called The Folded Wing. The lone duck in Medici fountain slips her beak beneath the wing and falls asleep, drifting like a hat tossed into a green pond. How good it feels to be one's own comfort, to discover all the warmth we need buried in our bodies. Yes, we bleed, we are broken, we get just one body. Yet there it lies most of the time, calling to us, saying, rest here, lie down in me. I am more than less than you, even in a world that treats us as two. Thanks.
John, that was beautiful.
Thank you, Doug.
Love those poems. And I love the way that you remind us that we live in a world that can do a pretty decent job of caretaking small bits of land and property and still doesn't know how to caretake around other human beings. And I feel like the beauty and empathy that you find in these poems is really just incredibly moving.
Oh, thank you so much.
I wanted to go back to something that you said. I only have my own two eyes. And I feel like, you know, that's both like the limitation of the artist, but also the genius, because we have to develop that third eye, that imaginary eye, that gets us around the problem of our own subjectivity. I'm starting tonight with a poem. This was written a few years ago, but it seems even more pertinent today. It's entitled Long Night, Full Moon. You only watch the news to find out where the fires are burning, which way the wind is blowing, and whether it will rain. Forecast ahead, but first, a mother's boy laid out in the street for hours. These facts don't wash away. Climbing inside the Statue of Liberty, climbing inside the idea of what that represents, I think is a really interesting thing, because we live in a country that was founded on the principle of being willing to fight for individual liberty. And this weekend is Pride Weekend. Yay.
Yeah.
I've got a virtual thumb, but I'm just using my real one. You know, over the years, I've become so disenamored of Pride Weekend, because it started out as really this sort of revolutionary thing, taking the streets and claiming a place for oneself as a queer person in San Francisco and in other cities around the world, felt like an incredibly empowering act, which has gradually been overtaken by product placement. And, you know, it's been sort of diluted so that the really most radical representations of queerness and sexuality have sort of been swept to the edges. We don't want any nudity. We want, you know, family-friendly homos. This poem, John published in his magazine, Freeman's Journal. It's called The End of the Pride Parade. I wrote this when there was a Pride Parade. This year there isn't, so I guess I got my wish. It's not going to be, you know, this garrulously long parade of tchotchkes. I went to the parade and watched people wave at Wells Fargo. I watched them wave at Harvey Milk, now more than 30 years dead, and lift up their phones. Look at me with a drag queen, they'll scream at their kids one day. Love has been sponsored into law, but a lot of you didn't vote for it. I did not come for the free t-shirt. I came for the free condoms that'll sit in my hope chest like a bill that keeps getting tabled in Congress. Where is the fuck brigade? I went to the dick parade. It was the same as this, but I didn't get a lei from the US Bank. There was no Chipotle float. Homo estas with a giant foil wrapped cylinder representing the burrito of equality. Folks are cheering in the streets for Walmart, whose workers have shown up pushing unironic shopping carts. After them comes Dignity Health and Yahoo, Orlando Strong. Then Macy's and the Berkeley Free Clinic. Someone ran off with our dildo and turned it into a marketing tool. Bring back the street hose, baby. Don't step in the vomit. And this poem I'm reading because it's in a journal that John and I are both in, entitled Alta. They are a West Coast magazine, nice, big, beautiful, glossy publication, and they publish poetry, which is really cool. And I wrote this while I was out of the country, as the coronavirus anxiety was ramping up here. Not that I knew necessarily what was going on back home, because, you know, part of the being on vacation is trying to shut out the news or not paying attention to the news. But the news was getting to me in other ways. This is called Summons. Like, you know, a summons. A goodness that isn't in us until it's in us. Little cakes, jam filling, something to tide us over. Except it comes from inside and has no decoration. What if I reached down deep, he said, and there was nothing? That's when I got scared for all of us. What if? Being the hour of disquiet. On the bridge, a woman heaped over with a cup extended beyond her as far as she could reach and still grasp its paper sides. What if every mother bore a cup and asked us to hold that cup while she went for milk? Did you step past already? You are not remarkable. You did the expected thing. You watched the gulls diving for bread upon the water down below. Are you saving for a house? And if you own it, will you own it as a sanctuary from the worst suffering? Will it keep you like a cookie until mealtime? This should keep you. Tuppence. Goodness, are you there? You got it in you. Goodness that only goodness knows. How do the sad go shopping? Sadly, some of this, some of that. Toothpaste, something in case of company, in case of fire.
There you're on the screen.
And folks hit their mute buttons when they, yeah, thank you. There's, I've been using Zoom these past couple of months, and I finally figured out I mute everyone upon entrance for precisely that reason. So we don't get the echo effect. I'm gonna read a couple of poems from this chapbook. This just came out on April 1st from a press called Rescue Press in Iowa City.
Atlas One.
Atlas T. Atlas T.
Atlas T.
And it's only an edition of 250. All of the proceeds, every penny, including the labor cost and the mailing cost, all goes to Youth Speaks, which is a San Francisco organization that creates safe spaces for young people to find their voices in poetry. The poems are all 6 lines long. Each of them has a title. The titles are all stolen from the DVD version of a movie co-authored by Stephen Sondheim and Anthony Perkins called The Last of Sheila. So I just took the chapter titles from the DVD because sometimes I don't want to bother coming up with titles, and I just stuck the titles on the poems after they were written. So it was kind of like a, match game. A body discovered. Until love seals me in a bag inside a heavy morgue drawer and tags me, I am anyone's paramour. Butterfly among the marigolds. In the impossible summer city, I find your dumb boy bottom hanging out your dungarees, catching frisbee or something. It looks like you've got a little son. I don't care how much you don't love me. I am thy inconstant sparrow. Until you hear the loose seed of milk vetch rattle in the pod, that's how blue the long sky. There is yet no hawk's eye waiting, but the great monster will come to take me someday. When it tears me, don't look. When it tears me with its hard hooks, don't look. Do not resuscitate. I know the fog lets loose in wisps. They are the shape of moss on live oak limbs. I'll tell you when to code. The movie, The Last of Sheila, has 6 characters who are all implicated in some way in what starts out as a murder mystery parlor game and turns into a real murder mystery. I feel like that's some sort of metaphor for the United States right now. We're all implicated in murders that we're not committing, but we are committing by virtue of what we're allowing to happen. This one's called Puzzle Pieces. They haven't invented a morning after pill that actually gets rid of the morning after, as long as we're talking about where I've been. Down to the Easy Stop Market to grab some buds. That's when I ran into Hot Check Hannah, who wrote, you guessed it, a hot check, and got me some smokes. Somehow I still had $5 when I got to the bar. I wish I'd had it when I left. I could have used $5. I'm not even going to tell you what it was like to fuck in Eddie's trailer or Eddie's friend's trailer. Different Eddie, different trailer. God knows where he is now. Once we were close enough to give each other lice. The future is the present we leave for others. Besides the complications, there were bodies, the wonder of bodies, the misery of bodies. Oh, time, you done robbed me blind. This one's called Unclean Exit. Thinking about, urban planning and parks. They told me I must learn to kill my darlings, so I started with you. Release the body in spring like it's on sale. I see you in all things. Porn poodles, they are a separate breed, and anything else that is urban. The cinched bark of a tree, the restrictions on zoning. Once they tighten the belt, they ain't gonna loosen unless the old red hot poker up the bum. I refer, of course, to Edward II, who should have dumped his darling Gaveston. Planning, that's an urban thing. Dress in layers, peel throughout the day. Reflective panes so we can look past one another. In the midst of the city, we plant trees. They are chosen both to hide and to withstand men's urine, and of course, disease. And I'm going to end with this poem. It's the penultimate poem in the book, because, you know, I never want to give away the ending. Not that it's a novel and, you know, there's some sort of expected ending, but there are endings. So this is called Agreed on the Basics. And if you know the film, The Last of Sheila, this is right near where we figure out who the killer is. But this has nothing to do with the movie. You know, I'm just stealing these titles. Agreed on the Basics. Who wouldn't want to be lost in the clouds? They hide so much. They raise the eucalyptus hills, the radio tower. Even a lad in fluorescent green can go missing. Clouds rolled in upon his head. He wasn't dead, but not alive. He went to limbo. As all good pagans did, the towhead dead, not dead. The news blew in and out all day. Impossible to know which way to dress. Then there were so many other deaths who could keep track. Well, there were gods in the clouds and they kept track. They watched out. He was snatched up by something beautiful and deadly. That one-eyed monster love who swallows every Eve doth serve. And now there is the sun, the sweet sun we thought we'd lost. I was just hiding, he says. Oh, if he only says that. Thank you. Thank you for your for your silent hands. John, are you going to unmute yourself?
Hey,
There you are.
that was lovely.
Thank you. What a great pleasure to get to read with you.
Yeah, same here. I was before our event started. We were talking about the last time we saw each other, and what was the bar called?
Mr. Bing's.
Mr. Bing's. Yeah, we were just sitting there, and I remember the pleasure. You know, when you used to actually go out and stand and lean on things,
Yeah.
and how you would arrange your body in places, and
When
as
you
you were
weren't
reading,
afraid to touch the world.
yes, when it was okay. But one thing I want to ask you about is, you know, going back to the first poem that you read, you know, about how, you know, putting your bodies into the street, kind of take over a street and make a statement and kind of reframe the frame, if you will. And I wonder if you've been able to go out on any protests in the last couple of weeks, or if you had an experience of, you know, taking your own actual body out into the world in some way, and if the world feels different.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, right when the pandemic closure started, I started getting all of these emails from people who were rushing to put together anthologies for, you know, like responses to the pandemic. And I was thinking, which pandemic do they mean? I'm still living through the last one. And so, you know, going out in the street and putting your body on the line has always been a revolutionary part of my existence. I have been to protests, and I've been astounded at how beautiful people are with one another right now. I mean, you know, the news sells violence, they sell, you know, images of strife and disagreement. But when you get out into the streets, you realize that most people in this country really do want change. I wouldn't be out protesting a pandemic, but we have a deeper pandemic, which is not a virus that we can't see. It's a ideology we can't see, but we can see evidence of it. And I feel like it's really important to show up and be counted. What about yourself? Have you had some protest?
Yeah, I mean, I think the very first one came down my block. So that I just sort of simply left my house. And New York can be a bit of a drag, you know, in the same way that some of the things you were describing about the Pride Parade have obviously happened here too, and they've happened on other realms within New York. And so you're constantly sort of within a shopping mall of sorts. And, you know, when everything is about purchasing, it takes a lot of things away. And once the streets were taken over by people, they started to be redefined and what they meant. And you're right, the many, many tiny acts of kindness within that crowd when you're in a protest. And I went to about 12 or 13 in a row. And it was impossible to come away without feeling like something massive was happening. And it does, to me, reify a kind of belief in the holiness of the body and its power and what is there. And one of the things I really love about Eustis Landscape is that, you know, I grew up in this Sacramento in the San Joaquin Valley. There's a poem in there about the Sunrise Mall, which maybe there's one in every, you know, kind of central California town, Central
Citrus
Valley town. Yes, Citrus Heights. But, you know, and throughout the book, there are these spaces that are kind of mundane shopping malls, but they're charged and changed by erotics in many cases. And it completely alters the power of some of those places to create diminishing frames by bearing down on the beauty and experience of sex or a charge between two people. And I feel like a protest is like a macrocosm of something like that. It's not an erotic event, but it does have some erotics to it because it's so many bodies together. Yeah. And it was so, I guess this is a long-winded way of saying that it was very moving on a cellular level to be amongst that many people in the middle of a pandemic that set us apart, because it made it feel like you could, you know, transmit a desire through change through almost non-linguistic levels, because clearly those have been failing us.
Len Hajinian said something to me years ago at a party, and I think about it every day. How else do we know the world except through our bodies? And I think that, you know, when we're faced with an ideological construct which is threatening to crush us and threatening to diminish our lives or to destroy them, the only way to combat that is to show up and be present in your body. I love the metaphor of the Statue of Liberty and going inside of it. And I also kind of chuckled when you were reading, because when I read your book, I didn't get this at all, but suddenly it flashed in my head that image of the Statue of Liberty buried up to its chest in sand from the end of the greatest movie made in 1968, which was Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
Were you thinking about that at all?
It was actually. I was thinking constantly about the way we signpost history and the way that our culture is constantly making fun of that sense of eternity I mean, there are a lot of monuments in the park, the literal park that I'm in, but everywhere we go, we're surrounded by monuments. And I was thinking about them a lot in 2016, because it was like watching someone, you know, at least in this country, try to turn himself into a living monument. And it was just absolutely fraudulent. And then so I spent a lot more time looking at monuments everywhere I went, and I have been for a while. And I thought, we've made monuments of truly terrible things. But one thing that I wanted to talk to you about with regard to sort of just landscapes and citizenship and living in sort of end times that also came out of your work is, I don't know about you, but music means a lot more to me now than ever, you know. And I sometimes turn it on, and it's overwhelming. And I think this is one of the reasons why poetry lately has been so powerful when it's really good, is that it reminds you of the connection to music. And you have a lot of sort of rhyming couplets and things in your poems. And I wonder if you can, on just a structural level or just a poet level, talk to me about that, because all of your forms are very different, and within your poems, you sometimes get to these places where you are almost silly, and then suddenly 2 or 3 lines later, the poem is terrifying, or it's incredibly moving. And one of the things I love about pop culture is it can take something that's moving, like a Statue of Liberty that's given to a country in gratitude and sort of this, or also mutual ideas of liberty. And then, a film published in the height of the Vietnam War during the Nixon years can bury that in sand and throw apes around it and make a very powerful political statement. And I wonder if you can talk about rhymes as a way to tilt a poem or add humor to it.
Well, I think that there are all sorts of ways of rhyming, sonically, but also imagistically. We can circle back to ideas the way you just did with the Statue of Liberty. And I am thinking, yes, the thing is, you reintroduce an idea, but you twist it a little bit more. Now we're at the point where, liberty is buried about up to here. This is the world we're living in now. And the sand is going to be shutting off our entire apparatus soon. I think that rhyme is a way to sort of, create delight. But I also go back to, I wanted to be a playwright before I ever wanted to be a poet. And I loved the way Shakespeare would give us a rhymed couplet to close a scene, to let us know people are about to go off stage. And so sometimes I do that deliberately, at a point where you're not going to go off stage. So it's a little bit like when the music rises on the TV show and you're like, oh, they're cutting to a commercial. But there's no commercial. We're still in it. We're still trapped inside the reality of the poem.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask you a question. You said in your dictionary of the undoing, being a global citizen today means doing one's research about the things that touch us. Can you say a little bit more about, what it means to do research as a writer, as a person living through words in today's climate?
Yeah, it's a kind of overwhelming totality when you think about it. For me, it covers everything from the clothes you wear to the food you eat to the people that you work with, the people. And I'm an editor, so it's the people I publish. Which is not to say that I have a kind of height-based morality test, the way like when you were a kid, you couldn't get on certain amusement park rides until you were 50 inches tall. But I do, you know, we're trying, I think, in literature to create alternative spaces, you know, for the mind and for the body to enter in a strange spell-like, you know, trance, if you will. You know, words on a page. When we were at that bar, Oscar Villalone was saying, words on a page that you read that produces a sensation and a vision of something that's not there. That's the definition of a spell. So as a writer, I think you have to have a lot of freedom in order to produce those things. But as a kind of literary citizen, you go back and forth between the spell and the materials of the spell, which is often things based in the real world. And so I've never been a real firm believer in art for art's sake, if that makes any sense. It always seemed strange to me that that was an actual thing that you had to defend, that somehow you couldn't be both, that you couldn't be beautiful and engaged at the same time. And
I know. Sometimes
you know,
for me, just making art is a way of keeping myself from going nuts.
yeah, from not going insane. And I love in your books how you veer between things, you know, that are in some ways in the news, and then sometimes it's something that's very, very private, and it constantly tilts what your definition of the news is. So for me, I think I as a writer and an editor, I get obsessed with things to try to understand them, and that keeps introducing me to other writers, actually, and that those writers create expanded versions of reality. And so one of my frustrations of living in the world as a citizen of the news or consumer of news, and as a person tied to political spheres, is I feel like I wish we could have much better talking heads. You know, what if Robbie Ellen McGueen could go on to Lawrence O'Donnell, you know, instead of Lawrence Tribe for the 18th millionth time? And you know, Professor Tribe is an expert in constitutional law and is great. We need him, but I just feel like we've tried political experts for a long time. Why don't we try poets or novelists or comedians?
Or yeah. I would subscribe to a channel of just Robbie sitting around and talking about life and the world. He's so funny. And so
I think he's probably broadcasting that channel right now to himself. This is one of the most intelligent and amusing people probably on the face of the world. And he
put his name into the chat function.
Let's see, maybe he's come in under his cat's name. But he's also just a beautiful novelist, and he comes up with ideas the way that that I think are desperately needed in political discourse. So one of the things he's deeply against is preconceived emotions in literature. I'm sure he's talked to you about this, but you know, Kool-Aids or the Art of War, his 1996 novel about the civil war in Lebanon and the AIDS crisis, is it does some of the things we were talking about with rhymes and upsetting expectations, in that here's a poem about two terrible things, and yet it is a novel about two terrible things, and it's making you laugh, and it refuses to kind of go towards plangency when you are expected to get that thing. And I think that is the sort of, to me, the direction of thought, you know, when you kind of upend expected situations.
John, we're getting some questions in the chat function here. There's one for you from Neil Hammonds. Neil, do you want to unmute and ask the question? Can you unmute yourself? Oh, there.
Oh yeah, there is.
Am I good now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? All right. Okay. So John, I was going to ask you just with both with your poetry collection and with Freeman's, with the journal, if you started with a theme and then looked for the work, or if you kind of started with the work and waited for the theme to emerge. So that was the first question I was going to ask you, and then just how you selected the stuff that was in your Freeman's anthologies.
That's a great question. Thank you. I think with the last issue of Freeman's, which is themed to California, I had to choose the theme in advance because otherwise I would have had non-Californians floating around. And I did that because I felt like there's a lot of amazing writing coming out of California, and that's happening right now that isn't leaving California, or there was a moment to be celebrated necessarily. And, you know, some people are well known and some are not. And I felt like this would be a great chance to see what happened if I put the best I could get together in one book. And so that's how I was lucky enough to get one of Doug's poems. And there's poems by lots of other wonderful writers in there, Mater Vang, Frank Bedart. Natalie Diaz is a poet from Needles, but she has an essay. But normally with the anthologies like that, I sort of start buying pieces that I fall in love with, and then a theme emerges. And with my poems, I was really just searching for a kind of purchase on the world in a way. Like I was trying to figure out what the world was telling me by looking at it and by trying to imagine my way into it and look at myself in that situation. And that ended up becoming the book, sort of trying to break down sensory boundaries and thinking of an ecosystem that wasn't entirely human centric, which a park is. You know, it's made by humans, but the animals don't know that. The animals have been there or have been there for a while. What about you, Doug? Do you, when you start to put together a collection, do you have an idea of where you're going, or do sometimes the shape of it emerge as a surprise?
Yeah, I try to live my life not knowing where I'm going. I feel like, generally speaking, it's a better way to experience the world, because then your expectations are not, you know, in any way disappointed. And I feel that way in particular with poetry. It's like poetry seems to me to be one of the last things that you can do with absolutely no materials. Nothing about the poem has to have been touched by a machine in any way. You can just, you know, I mean, you can just experience a poem in your mind, in your body, in your voice, in your hands. And I love the freedom of poetry. So I think this kind of ties into the next question, which is from Cristina Coppa. So I'm going to let her ask that question, and then we can both talk a little bit about it. Cristina, can you unmute?
Oh, yes. So my question was about craft. When crafting a poem, what do you usually look for? What are you trying to convey, at least most of the time? Not every poem is the same, but what is the message that most of the time you find yourself wanting to give to the reader?
Crafting. Well, I mean, you know, I think when I'm writing a poem, first of all, it starts with a little idea, a seed, some words that get stuck in my brain. And it's a little bit like what happens to an oyster when a little bit of sand gets inside it, and it starts to create all these layers of nacreous solution to kind of smooth over that piece of sand, to wrap its oyster mind around it. And so for me, craft is something that sort of grows from a center outward. What about you, John?
That is such a great description. It makes me also miss oysters. It's very similar. For example, the last poem I read, about the lone duck in the Medici fountain, I actually was having a ruinous day, and I was in a horrible mood, and I was walking around like all angry, and I saw this duck sort of floating in circles with its beak, tucked under its wing, and I thought, why am I, using my body to make myself angrier or hold my anger? Why don't I just, sit down and chill out a little bit? And so I thought, what if that was the beginning of a poem? Where would it go? And I had a notebook with me, so I just sat down, and I thought, okay, the first thing I have to do is describe that image. The lone duck in the Medici fountain slips her beak beneath her wing and falls asleep, drifting like a hat in a green pond. And then that creates a kind of mood and atmosphere. How do I, as Doug was talking about with his with rhyme and other elements of poetry, like how do you turn the idea? How do you turn the idea of comfort? And what is the idea that's there? And so I each kind of line raises the stakes and the possibilities of the next line or two. And that's sort of the way my brain works when I'm writing poems. And I don't know about you, Doug, but once I get into that mode, everything I see ends up, the back of cereal boxes, little scraps of paper, that it all becomes kind of food.
Yeah. I feel that way too. Like anything can find its way in. The poem becomes this creature that needs to feed off of language. And what language does it feed off of? Whatever you're surrounded by.
I love your mixture in your poems. There's a very a frankly really dirty poem in Useless Landscape called Chicken. That goes back and forth between high Anglo-Saxon language and sort of a more Californian language, and it's so incredibly mesmerizing. That it makes me wonder what books you have open, because it does feel like the romantic poetry and Shakespeare feel very close to your sonic sound.
Yeah, I don't know what I was reading when I wrote Chicken, but I feel like maybe the guiding spirit of that poem was probably Jean Genet, because I was playing with like some slang that is used in prisons and jails. This ties in with the next question, which is from, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Jimena Blanco, Jimena?
Hi, you did say it correctly. I was wondering, because this is my first pandemic, has your relationship to your body and to the bodies around you, whether they be flesh or made of a different material, changed during the pandemics you've lived through? And has it ever gone back to feeling somewhat resembling normal?
I don't know what normal is. And I don't know if I've ever known. I feel like life is an obstacle course all the time. It might not feel that way for everyone, but it always feels that way for me. So, changes. Well, I feel like right now I am so responding to this feeling of isolation and being closed in. I'm used to, I'm an outdoor cat. and suddenly I'm shut up indoors. And so I find I've been watching a lot of Esther Williams and Carmen Miranda movies because they're saturated with color and sound and music. And so I feel like I'm sort of starved for stimulation right now. And I think that's finding its way into the poetry writing as well. What about you, John?
I think the biggest experience I've had, bodily since the pandemic, since having COVID and getting better, what was going to protests, and there were different types of moods within the protests. Like there was a couple silent ones I was on that were really powerful, that just simply allowed the proximity of bodies moving and standing in space to express something. But it still doesn't get over the fact that, I haven't, I've hugged but one person in 4 months.
Yeah.
Maybe two, and that is I can't even begin to describe what that's doing to me. I know it's doing something. And, part of my reaction to it is to go outside and try to be outside. And even, I don't know if you felt this way or anyone else listening felt this way, but after I was sick for about 3 weeks and was indoors, and then I was better, and I went outside, and the air, when it wasn't wind, I could feel it on my eyeballs. And I thought, am I just suddenly sensitized now to what it feels like to be outdoors? And I don't know, I kind of agree with Doug in that I sort of tip forward into every day in a state of hopefulness, but chaos, sometimes both. And I think, to me, that's the only way to function. But I don't know what it's going to do to us to be physically apart from each other for this long. Because the first thing that happens if you're born is you're hugged to a body. That's a natural instinct, and for that to be
out of a body, and you still want to touch it.
Yeah, and I actually, Doug, I've seen you a few times in various locations, and I think we've hugged a few times. I can remember what it feels like to hug you. But I have to mentally do that now, in the same way that it's a sense that's browned out, that, you have to kind of reactivate, but it's not an obvious thing, and it's really a drag. I think we communicate that way, and we share information that way. And, lately I think the only response, and I'll be like every other person under the quarantine and the aftermath, is I've ended up cooking a lot, because it's a way to touch someone without touching them.
Yeah, and also it feeds that need that the body has. Like, we have an appetite for each other, and now we have to supplant that appetite with just an appetite for food. I think we're all getting a little bit rounder.
Yes.
Which will be good if we end up in real starvation mode. But yeah, there's something about missing that, and that's why I think it's so wonderful to have an event like this, because not only are we able to have our virtual visit to City Lights, a physical place that we love and have physical memories of, but we're also able, through the miracle of electronic surveillance equipment, to be visited by people from all across the globe and the world. So you know, there is something good happening, which is that people are finding ways to touch each other in ways that maybe replace some of that physicality.
I do find these strangely intimate, you know. I think because you can see into everyone's homes and your face is as big as the screen, and I spend most of my day at this object, my computer, looking at it, and now suddenly there's all these people in it. You know, some people I know, some people I don't know. Sarah Cruz, Robert, you know, and there are names across the top, and it's actually, it is a different kind of together, you know. So thank you, City Lights, for making this possible.
The last question is from Stacy Lewis, and I think it's really perfect. Want to ask Stacy? Oh,
just my son is behind me watching YouTube. Imagine. Okay, I'll read what I wrote. Okay. John, the clock behind you has stopped at 8:20. I just realized it hasn't moved during this entire event. Is that symbolic of something, or do you need a battery?
Yeah, the short answer is battery, but yeah, there's symbols everywhere, and that is definitely one of them. But I am in the strange flat circle of time, and have been for a while. You know, I think we all, yeah, Doug's right. We could all use a new battery. One of the nicest things anyone's ever done for me when I lived with them is secretly wind the clock in my bathroom before we went to bed. She would sneak in there and do that. And it was like this tiny thing that became so regular for a while, I didn't notice it. And I realized, wait a second, I've never wound that clock. And so, yeah, some clocks wind down and others keep going. Anyway, I should let everyone get on with their evening. It's 10, a little after 10 here in New York, and it's probably dinner time in California.
And it's 8:20 somewhere.
It's 8:20, and yeah, Mountain Time or whatever.
Thank you both. This was really, really quite fantastic. And the thing that I'm going to miss the most really is like the going out for drinks part, which
let's do it.
So a rain check to you both for that drink. And thank you all for coming. Since you're poetry lovers, I will point out that City Lights actually has a couple of books that are forthcoming. One, Uchi Naduka, and then the other one from Sophia Dalin. They're both going to be in the Spotlight series. And then also there's a book by Jean Dive about Paul Celan. So those are coming out in the fall. Keep an eye out. You can check out our website. Also, a bunch of events coming up. We've got Ben Ehrenreich coming up in July. We've got John Nichols and Robert Shear talking about the state of the disunion. There's a Philip Whalen tribute sponsored by Wave Books. So just pop onto our website, check it out. Thank you all for being here. And, you know, this is also really weird. You know, this is the moment where I just cut it off and then we're all gone. And I'm just going to like not do that. I'm just going to sit here for a moment and we can all just sort of like stare at each other for a couple of seconds. And thank you all for being here.
Peter, thanks for hosting this. It's almost as good as getting to see you in the flesh. I love that you've got the virtual background of the bookstore.
The poetry room. Love you all.
Love you too. And that's also important to say to everyone, I love you, because when will you get another chance? And we need more love now more than ever.
Very much.
I went to a Zoom mitzvah this weekend, and as everyone was leaving, they said a little something. So please unmute yourself, say something.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good job.
Stay well. Stay well.
Thank you. Be well and safe.
Hi, Doug.
Lovely discussion.
Bye, Carol.
Love you.
I
And
don't
love
want it to end.
John's work as well. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Carol.
This was really
Thanks,
lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great.
I'm not good at making hearts, but is that one? A heart with wings.
Oh, I can't do that.
Thank you, thank you. I could have listened to this go on and on and on.
Yes.
Hi, Kathleen.
Hi, Doug.
So good to see you.
You too. So I can't go out with you afterwards, but I am having a cocktail.
I imagine you're having a few.
Yep. Can't resist.
All right. Good
We'll
to
see
see everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Hi, Doug.
Hi, Judy. Hi, Maggie.
Very good to see you, Doug. This is Paloma. Good to see you, John.
Hi, Paloma.
How are you, Doug? So nice to see you.
So good to see you too. Well, I can't see you.
Yeah, I know. I was here, and then I'm actually in San Francisco. I don't know if you're going to see me just yet or at all.
Well, hopefully we will. I don't know what the hell is going to happen. I feel like, we all need to just like stay indoors for a couple more weeks. If you hug anyone, hug someone in a MAGA hat and then burn your clothes.
Oh my God. It's really good seeing you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.